Hello and welcome back to Choices, Chapter 15, Changing the House Rules. This chapter is really valuable in understanding how the dynamics of a relationship can change and abuse can enter into the picture, as well as how to reverse those dynamics and repair the relationship. It can also be very valuable if you are out of the relationship but want to gain some better insight into what happened and making sure that you don't repeat those same behaviors in a future relationship. So in chapter 15, Dr. Adams describes some stages of a relationship. The first stage is everybody's favorite, the honeymoon period. The honeymoon period, which is in the very beginning, dating, meeting, getting together stage, there is an emphasis on making a good impression, which makes sense because you're trying to attract a partner and lock down a relationship. So a lot of effort goes into one's appearance, how they present their life, with the goal of making a good impression and making the other individual interested in forming a relationship or union. In this stage, the honeymoon period, anger is managed and not displayed. Hostility is not allowed. So I make a distinction here between anger and hostility. So anger is the emotion, getting angry at your spouse. Hostility is the behavior. So hostility would be verbally lashing out or even physically acting out. Hostility is not involved in this honeymoon period, again, because everything is wonderful and the emphasis is on making a good impression. So even if there is anger, it is not outwardly expressed. Go further with this honeymoon period. There is a book that I highly recommend if you are back in the dating scene or considering perhaps in the future getting into another relationship. The book is called I Only Want to Get Married Once, but it easily applies if you've been married and are just looking for a future relationship or maybe even a marriage in the future. The author is Hannah Levitin, and she is a marriage and family therapist. And she spends a lot of time and research on this honeymoon period, which she describes as a period of infatuation. And in this infatuated period, that's when you first meet, dating, the initial stages of getting together. There is an actual physiological chemical process that is happening. So there are neurotransmitters in the brain that are attached to pleasure and seeking, wanting something. There are hormones that are reacting, that are perpetuating kind of this cocktail of euphoric, good feelings, kind of like a high. She refers to this as a natural high during the initial stages of the relationship. The issue is that, like every other chemical process that we've described with the brain, whether it's that fight or freeze, flee response, or just other instances of being very angry at a time, we've talked about the importance of allowing for a time out, just a break, because what happens naturally is with the brain, the body, there is a tendency to return back to normal, to baseline homeostasis, because it requires a lot of energy and effort to stay at a heightened level. So the brain and the body's natural tendency over time is to return back to normal, whether we're talking about anger or fear, or in the case of the honeymoon period, euphoria. These are temporary states. So what she talks about in this book, I Only Want to Get Married Once, is that what she sees as a therapist over and over and over again is that people who are in this infatuated period, kind of under the influence of these neurotransmitters and hormones, are making decisions, critical decisions, decisions that will affect the rest of their life while they're basically under the influence. When you're under the influence, judgment is a little impaired, your understanding of long-term consequences might be a little distorted. People making decisions about their lifetime partners, including financial decisions, including decisions about having babies, under a period of intense euphoria that is temporary. So inevitably what happens is this infatuated period simmers down and people return back to their kind of baseline levels. And this can come kind of as a major disappointment as the high slowly fades out. People can experience that as they are falling out of love or no longer as interested in their partner, see something wrong with the relationship. They may even seek out other partners during this time because they're craving that euphoric experience that they once had, but has faded out as the relationship has settled in and things become more comfortable, routine, kind of normal. What she talks about in this book is that some people will experience this as the relationship kind of fizzling out. However, her argument is that that is exactly the time when real love and actual strong attachment begins to take hold. As the infatuation period fades out, the opportunity to have real love, real intimacy, real connection, and real partnership takes hold. So she gives examples about how working as a team and being committed to the relationship is actually far more important than this initial infatuation period. But I recommend the book if you're out of a relationship and perhaps dating, because she gives some very specific and solid recommendations about questions that you can ask yourself in a dating relationship that help to determine whether you're really in this infatuation period or this is potentially actually a very good match. So there's a link here to an interview with her. The book is actually more interesting than the interview, but you can at least get a kind of sense of this. I'll include this link on the actual Word homework assignment. So not because you have to for this class, but if you are somebody who is out of the relationship, perhaps back into dating and really wants to do things differently, I recommend this book. I've given it as a gift to my sisters and friends. Makes a wonderful stocking stuffer. So continuing on with this idea of stages in a relationship. Once the honeymoon period ends and reality enters the scene, Dr. Adams talks about a next stage that some couples enter into. And it begins by changing the rules of the relationship. So previously, during the honeymoon phase, the rule was no hostility is allowed. So even if you're upset and even if you're angry, that is managed effectively because no outward bursts of yelling, swearing, cussing, name calling, hitting, punching, choking would ever be accepted at that stage. However, as the relationship continues, that previous rule of no hostility allowed changes. And it changes when one person decides to step out of the box with verbal abuse, yelling, swearing, name calling, insults. When that happens, there is a pull or an invitation for the other person to join in on the hostility. At this time, that "I don't care what I say" line has been crossed, and then reactive, kind of natural response might be for the other person to do the same. So the first rule change in the relationship is solidified two ways. Either one, by the partner also participating in the verbal abuse, so swearing, yelling, throwing insults back, or by the other partner passively accepting the hostility, which means that they don't object to it in a meaningful or an assertive and a direct way. So by not saying that verbal abuse is unacceptable and taking assertive measures to follow that up, it becomes passively accepted, and the rules and the dynamics of the relationship are now different. There's also a possibility of a second rule change. The second rule change comes when there has been a growing comfort with hostility in the relationship. So what happened one time with one person stepping out of the box, crossing the "I don't care what I say" line, has now become more routine. This has happened over and over again, sometimes with the other person joining in or just simply accepting. And tension in the relationship has risen to new levels. So with each passing fight, the degree of tension, anger increases, and the verbal abuse just becomes normal. There's this old saying about putting a frog in a pot of boiling water. You might have heard this. Do you know what happens when you put a frog in a pot of boiling water? The frog jumps out because the water's really hot. But if you put a frog in a pot of lukewarm water and slowly, over time, increase the temperature of the water until it eventually reaches the boiling, you know what happens to the frog? It remains in the pot of boiling water and burns to death. That's kind of what is happening here. There is a growing comfort. It becomes normal, becomes routine, it becomes expected. And when somebody gets really, really upset, they cross the "I don't care what I say" line, say what comes to their mind, no matter how harmful it is. Maybe the other person joins in, maybe there's an apology later, but it happens again, happens again. When this dynamic takes place, problems are no longer being solved, couples not working together as a team. It's just a transition from one hostile interaction into calm into another one. And there's a decrease in some of these positive, affectionate feelings, the feelings of love and attachment, which we know are so important to the relationship. The couple is no longer working together as a team, but more often working against each other. And here comes the scenario where, for the first time, someone crosses the "I don't care what I do" line. Here's where it goes from verbal abuse, crosses the line into something physical or even sexual abuse. Once that door opens, the likelihood of this now becoming part of the relationship increases. This rule change is solidified when, number one, either the other person participates back in the physical abuse, The one person crosses the I don't care what I do line, does something physical, throws something, hits something, punches something, grabs, pulls, bites, any form of physical abuse. And the response by the other person is to reciprocate and do the same. The second way this can be solidified is the other person passively accepting the abuse without objecting to it in a meaningful way. Once this rule change is in place and physical abuse is now acceptable into the relationship, what naturally happens is for the abuse to increase in severity over time. Just because this has been the case in the relationship does not mean that these rules are locked in. In fact, just as easily as these rules were changed in the beginning from the honeymoon phase into the acceptance of verbal or physical or even sexual abuse, these rules can be altered. So let's talk now about repairing the relationship. The first step in repairing the relationship is to make a commitment. This is a personal commitment to remove hostility from your own behavior. Hostility is just referencing verbal or physical abuse. So if you take that away as an option, you are making for yourself the very first step in repairing the relationship and rewriting these rules. The second is to not give in to the pull of verbal or physical abuse. That is to say, if your partner continues on with any form of abuse, don't accept that invitation and respond back in the same manner. This one's really, really difficult, particularly for somebody who's put a lot of effort into the first rule and they themselves have made a commitment to not engage in the same behavior. It's really difficult when you've made that change and the other person hasn't. But here's where that commitment and the leadership and the relationship comes into place. Somebody has to change. And if you're seriously committed to doing things differently, let that person be you. Don't give in to the pull of verbal or physical abuse. Which means to say that you would assertively respond to abusive behavior by assertively stating that it is unacceptable and to re-engage in problem solving. However, there are situations where that may not be possible. Somebody is actively using abuse against you. And in those cases, to consider what we talked about in the prior class. That if you are being abused, the way to assertively respond to that, to get out of the situation, by utilizing emergency resources, including our FAP program, including police if necessary, to do what you can do to get out of the situation safely without responding in kind. The next tip is to understand that this change, it might be gradual. It probably took a long time to get to this point in the relationship where abuse is normal, acceptable, routine, and it may take a while to fully transition out of that into a new dynamic. But recognize small success. Recognize those instances which in the past might have been a blow up and now have turned into just an actual conversation and some problem solving. Recognize when that happens. Okay, so those were some steps that you can take to repair the relationship. If you are no longer in the relationship, hopefully this is still helpful to you in recognizing how to alter dynamics in a relationship, even if some of this has already entered into the scene. And let's talk about homework for chapter 15. Question number 4 is describe the rule change process in your relationship or your prior relationship. So here's where you're thinking back. How did things change from the honeymoon period? You can describe what that was like, to verbal or physical abuse in the relationship. Number 5, if you are currently in the relationship, what steps can you take to change the rules of the relationship? So how can you alter that process if it's already entered into the relationship? But if you are not in the relationship, what information from this chapter could you use in a future relationship? And number 6, pretend your partner accuses you of not doing your share of the chores. Call that dishes, laundry, yard, but you disagree. And as you talk, tempers rise and your partner insults you. Give examples of an assertive response, a hostile response, and a passive response. There's more information on that one in the book if you need it. All right, so that is chapter 15. For our next class, we're going to skip 16 and go straight to 17 and 18. Thank you very much for being here and look forward to seeing you next time.